Warships in Antiquity were essentially man-powered platforms designed to bring combatants into range with their opponents. The capabilities and limitations of these fleets were dictated by the personnel on board. As always, the human element was key, and we will therefore be diving into a discussion regarding the staffing, operation, and maintenance of the Roman Republican Navy. Once Roman warships were constructed, they would be assigned a crew. Typically, leadership included a squadron commander, captain, pilot, rowing officer, and bow officer. There would also be specialists aboard, such as a carpenter, engineer, physician, musician, timekeeper, and several sailors. However, the bulk of the crew would have been the rowers or marines. A typical quinquirium, for instance, could hold about 300 rowers with a contingent of 120 marines. In the Roman Republic, rowers would primarily have been free citizens rather than the chained-up slave gangs of Hollywood movies. These men were drawn from Rome's poorer classes and supplied the majority of the labor force required. Admittedly, though, the available manpower is not always enough, and Roman commanders occasionally did turn to recruits from allied states, prisoners of war, and slaves. For instance, when Scipio captured New Carthage, he impressed the population to service in his fleet with the promise of freedom after the war as a reward. Octavian was also recorded to have freed 20,000 slaves and recruited them to row against Sextus Pompey. Regardless of where they came from, these rowers would have had to be trained. Neglecting to do so would mean that ships could not propel themselves in battle and would be virtual sitting ducks. It was therefore crucial for rowing crews to practice proper timing and coordination. Polybius recounts how the Roman rowers in the First Punic War practiced their technique on land while the fleet was being built. At sea, the pace of rowing might be kept by hammerstroke or by song. The songs were generally used while out of combat when a ship was operating at cruise speed. Evidence suggests that the song would be made up of around 4 quadruplets of hexameters. Each quadruplet would involve a call and response, starting with the same expression. The first hexameter would be sung by the orator, while the rowers replied with the following 3 lines. In this way, the pace could be set and the rowers would be distracted from their fatigue. Singing this song slowly might result in a pace of around 15 strokes a minute, while a quicker pace could accelerate the rowers to around 20 strokes a minute. In battle, absolute silence would be required from the crew, and singing was replaced by the drums. Roman naval troops were not part of a special military branch. Rather, they were simply soldiers drafted from the legions for operations at sea. This might be done at the start of a campaign or on the fly. For instance, at Actium, Mark Antony had failed to gain an advantage on land and decided to load 20,000 legionaries onto his fleet to best Octavian at sea. Typically, Roman marines were assigned to the fleet and divided up amongst the available ships. As a result, large infantry blocks would have been broken up into many smaller units. It appears that men boarded warships with their century and were commanded by the centurions and optios. This arrangement meant that the lower-ranking officers played an even more important role in directing combat at sea than on land. Evidence indicates that Roman marines would have been equipped in the same manner as their land-based counterparts. Weapons, armor, and equipment matched the standards of the day, but it seems sensible to assume that there was at least some deviation. For instance, one might guess that marines could have stored and used a greater number of javelins in order to weaken the enemy crews prior to and even during boarding action. Veterans in particular would surely have begun to tailor their gear towards naval combat. In fact, it appears that marines who saw long service with Rome's flotillas would modify their legion identification with sea or naval symbols. At first, infantry detailed to serve as marines would have been uneasy at sea. Some form of training might be conducted by officers of the ship's crew, but fresh marines were largely left to find their sea legs on their own. Once calibrated, these troops would find a familiarity in the close quarters fighting of boarding action. It is unclear how many men could actually swim, and we have no evidence of any special training to address this potential issue. Perhaps there was a cold acceptance of the fact that anyone who fell into the water with armor was likely to be dragged down as a result of the weight, regardless of their skill level. Naval battles would have created a lot of debris, which may have given men overboard something to keep them afloat. However, this might only delay the inevitable, as troops who didn't drown were still at the risk of being run over, hit by oars, targeted from above, or simply left to die. Rescue was simply not guaranteed. Built and staffed, a Roman ship was now ready for deployment. Once underway, the Romans on board would immediately start to deplete their provisions. Warships were already cramped, and there would be relatively little space for food and, most importantly, water. Using sails might minimize the human energy being expended, but nonetheless the hot Mediterranean sun would be punishing. Individuals would consume around 3 liters a day, which meant that the whole crew of a conqueror consumed about a half a ton of water a day, which was carried in skins and barrels. Additionally, the crew of a ship made up a large part of the ballast, and so they were confined to their seats for most of the trip, lest they rock the boat. Uncomfortable conditions and low supplies imposed a severe limitation on the strategic range of ancient navies. At most, journeys would last a couple days before requiring a resupply. Galleys of classical antiquity tended to hug the shorelines. This was largely due to the ease of such navigation in the absence of developed sea charts. Night travel would also be possible, as a course could be plotted using the stars and the moon. Ideally, though, a fleet would be drawn up on land every night to allow the crew to rest and reprovision. However, this meant that beached ships were extremely vulnerable to a land attack unless they could count on a secure base or nearby ground forces. This basic dynamic fundamentally dictated the nature of Mediterranean warfare. Naval operations required a careful coordination with supporting forces and could not project total power by themselves. Any standing fleet required nearly constant maintenance. This was because ancient warships became waterlogged over time and were quickly covered in barnacles. Both of these would significantly slow down a ship if left untreated. A continuous patrol of the seas was therefore out of the question. As a result, navies would only be raised when needed, and often spent large amounts of time in port. In fact, standing fleets of any size were rather rare, with the exception of the most preeminent Hellenistic kingdoms and the top-tier naval powers such as Carthage. The huge Roman navy of the First Punic War was an anomaly, born out of necessity, and it was soon decommissioned after the war. By the time the Romans could even think of funding a full-time fleet, they would have already been in position to subdue the Mediterranean powers around them on land anyways. What followed was therefore a period of relative inaction at sea, where warfare was characterized mostly by piracy. It would not be until the explosion of wide-scale fighting during the Civil Wars that money once again poured into the construction and operation of huge fleets. These spikes in violence would bring hundreds of ships together in battle. We will therefore be obliged to follow up on this episode with an analysis of the weapons and tactics of Roman warships.